It is May 24th, 2024, and it has been 84 days since March 1st, 2024, and 167 days since December 9th, 2023. The reason why I bring that information up is those were the planting dates of the plants that we are looking at today. There are two sets for most of these, and the plants in the front were planted March 1st and the plants in the back were planted December 9th. So we're going to look at those as it relates specifically to how these perform in a more temperate, mild, southeastern climate. So the first group of plants that we're going to look at is hairy vetch, the variety being Patagonia hairy vetch. What we can see on this is that we can see that the older, the more mature plant has put much more energy now into the reproductive process, and so it's already flowered. There's very few flowers on it, and there's seed pods. And this plant has pretty much stopped really growing in height. And I've used these sticks and some other ways to try to keep the plant elevated. In front of it is the same plant. This plant has grown half the days of the prior plant. What is most remarkable about this particular planting is really how much growth has happened in that short period of time. And here's a yardstick. So it has actually grown 36 inches in height in 68 days. So that's about a ½ inch a day if you look at it, and it seems like that's about the pace that it grows. Right now it is flowering. Our temperatures are reaching the 90s and the humidity starting to increase. So it will be interesting to see how long that will continue to grow. I am amazed at how fast that grows. This next set of plants is Dixie crimson clover, a very commonly used legume. It's used in the north and in the south. It's easy to plant and grows quite nicely, has beautiful flowers. The older the plants, as can be seen here, is approximately 15 inches. It's flowered, it's done flowering, and it looks pretty much like the plant itself is also done. And yet what's surprising is that it still has some leaf production, even though one would think that after flowering on an annual plant it would be done. In contrast, this is the one that's half its age, and it looks fantastic. It looks like it's got lots of vegetative growth, still in that vegetative stage. And right now there is approximately 4 inches of growth. The leaves are nice and big and lush. What this tells me is for situations where one enters into spring and is not expecting a whole lot because the heat's going to come on in a few months, that really with if you just got 60 to 90 days, crimson clover may be an option to seed out there, as you can also probably see with the hairy vetch. We move on to the next set, and these are actually a species called Berseem. There's two varieties. Balady 1 is on the left, Lightning is on the right. And we have noticed that with this particular species, these two varieties perform quite differently. One is much more upright in its growth, that's the Balady 1, and the Lightning has more growth, initially very prostrate, but over time, and I basically secured these so that we could actually keep their height in perspective. The Lightning actually seems to have caught up and is actually providing really maybe even just as much height or near the height, but definitely looks like it has more vegetative biomass. When we look at the height of these, we are looking at nearly 24 inches, 20 to 24 inches. But when you look at the actual kind of vegetative part and the biomass, there's quite a bit more in the Lightning compared to the Balady 1. The Balady 1 is pretty stemmy. Flower-wise, the Balady 1 was earlier. The Lightning still is. It's got some flower activity, but quite a bit of flowers. And that's for the older group, that's over 160 days. The younger group, at half the age, these are both still growing. There's a vegetative growth on both plants here. This one looks like it's got a flower that's starting. And this one, I don't see any kind of flowering activity yet. And frankly, they both look quite healthy. These trials would indicate that they would be good options for short-term forage or biomass in the spring, even down in warmer season climates. Now, we fully expect that the heat is going to eventually get to these, and we also would recognize that planting any of these so far, the Crimson or the Berseem or the Patagonia, planted in the spring, one would want to think about how it may affect the following crop. Let's say that's some C4 sorghum Sudans or millets or other grasses. One would want to think about how these would affect them if one wasn't going to terminate them either mechanically or chemically, because they may impede some growth that one would want on the C4 species. That said, they may also be some great contributors for nitrogen going into those plantings of those C4 species. Now, next to it, this one's been a little bit different. These are the Balansas. There's Bolta and Viper in the back and just a Viper in the front. And at this point, based on these trials, it looks like the Balansas are not as adapted to these warm season environments. The back two, which were established in December, did fine earlier in the spring, but they shut down quicker than some of the other species that were also planted in the same time frame. Secondarily, the front plants were planted at the same time as these other ones and definitely have not put out any kind of respectable biomass. So at this point, the recommendation for the Balansas would be that they would need to best be planted in the fall, and the earlier the better to provide the most productivity. Next to the Balansas is a Vernal Alfalfa. Vernal is a perennial legume. The December planting in the back looks just great. It's very nice, very healthy. There's approximately 13 inches or so of growth, and it's all very attractive vegetation. It's not gone to any kind of flowering at this point. The front has jumped out of the ground quite nicely, and if you look all the way down to the bottom, it has great attractive growth even down the bottom. And I think that's probably one of the things that one would note as far as alfalfa and use of alfalfa. Excellent vegetative growth all the way down to the bottom of the plant. You can see that in both the December and the March plantings. Now this is a perennial, so your most gain is going to be to utilize this in where you can keep it alive for multiple seasons. That said, there's possible some value there for short-term plantings where it will not last for over a year. Adjacent to it, here is the Marco Polo white clover, and this is doing exactly what white clover does really well. It grows. In the back, we're about 10 inches of growth, and nice and thick. The earlier spring plantings, these have been culled down, so there's I think only 3 or 4 plants in these, and they look great. So I think this just confirms that where you want to have white clover, like for pollinators like this fella right here, or for forage use, excellent. This will handle regrowth very well. It can be grazed, it can be harvested in multiple ways and come back. Again, like the Vernal Alfalfa, your most value is going to come when you can actually utilize that in a perennial setting. The final example is medium red clover. I did not have this planted in December. This is only planted in March. I am super impressed by how this grows. It is vigorous out of the ground. It has provided very nice big leaves early on. Again, we're not even 90 days yet. And like I said, I think I've culled these down. I think this is only 3 plants, and supports the idea of spring planted red clover can do fantastic very early on. And so the primary applications for red clover are for forage use, for grazing, for hay. It's actually mostly recommended for hay over grazing, because if you look at it, there really isn't as much material down low. So if that gets grazed down pretty low, you just don't see a whole lot of what I call solar panels. You don't see a whole lot of leaves that can regrow very quickly. Whereas compared to white clover, there's just a lot of little material there. There's a lot of growth that's just going to stay low. And this is actually even true of alfalfa, right? Look at alfalfa. Alfalfa still has some low material. So keep that in mind as you look for options for spring planting as well as for winter planting on legumes that could help out your forage needs as well as your cover crop needs. As we step back and take an overview of this very narrow trial, what conclusions could we make, or at least use as a basis to help us make better decisions for forages as well as for cover crops? I would say that one thing that we can conclude is hairy vetch really likes to grow in this environment. It's It's astounding. In fact, I'm gonna turn the camera around, and this was some volunteer planted hairy vetch that has climbed up our fence and is now actually over 6 feet tall. And we've traced this back down to I believe this is just one plant of hairy vetch. So if you're not familiar with hairy vetch, that would be one that you ought to become familiar with and see how it might work in your operation, whether it's for forage or whether it's for cover crops, and whether it's for fall planting, winter planting, and maybe even early spring planting. The other one that we can conclude is crimson clovers, pretty safe species, and could be used really without hesitation. It's very manageable, and it would be one that you would expect to get consistent growth out of when you seed. Kind of in a sense, it might be a bit of a no-brainer. I'm going to jump down actually over to white clover, because I would say white clover would be the same thing. The crimson and the white clover, they're pretty predictable. They're going to give you some biomass. It's not going to be massive, which means it's also not going to be unmanageable. Pay attention to the seeding rates, because these grow quite well, and so you don't need to waste your money by seeding too excessively. Along the lines of being very predictable, I'm going to throw red clover in there too. Again, this just looks like a species that if you're not familiar with, you ought to get familiar with and see how it fits in your application. Alfalfa is not commonly used in the southeast, but it's one that many researchers and forage experts have encouraged people to try, and I would say that there's some good reasons to do that. The other two categories are the Berseems and Balansas. First of all, make sure as you're thinking about those, you don't get those confused, because Berseem and Balansa, those two names are close enough that they can get swapped in conversation. But the Balansa, I think, is actually a much more elite crop, and it has a great purpose. It has a great place. It actually likes lower pH and likes wetter soils, and it will thrive where some things don't. In fact, that actually may be part of the reason why these trials aren't so good, is that these particular containers do not keep the soil super damp. This might have been different if they had been kept in more wet conditions. But I would say don't willy-nilly use these. Learn to use these with small trial and error. The Berseems, I'm very impressed with Berseem. The literature and people who have used them have referenced that they have very similar forage quality to alfalfa, and one of the uses is to seed into thinning alfalfa, because it doesn't have that allelopathic problem of seeding alfalfa into alfalfa, and I can see why. I think this spring planting here is really a good example that if you had thin alfalfa, you could put that in there. So in fact, just to note on that, there's, I think, one, two, I believe I culled these down to maybe 3 or 4 plants here. So look how thick that is. And here's the alfalfa, and alfalfa's that's 3 plants. So same planting time. So that it's an annual, it's not a perennial, so it's a short-term fix, but might be a pretty good fix in different environments. And they come in 2 different flavors at least. They come in the tall and the short. So fast growth or short term is going to be the Balady type, and the lightning type is going to be your a little bit slower growing but more vegetative. If you're not familiar with this one, I would suggest that you become familiar with it, keeping in mind that in this species category there are notable differences in the varieties.